All right, so this lecture kind of picks up where the last one left off a bit. We're going to be talking about not just slavery and some of those issues in the United States, but a bit more of the reform impulse that slavery engendered. So this is going to be another thematic lecture, the theme of slavery and the theme of reform, attempts to end slavery, but also other social reform impulses of the time, people attempting to change or better the society in which they lived in. So we're going to discuss slavery, alcoholism, women's rights, a couple different things. But we are going to first start out with answering the overarching question of the day, which is this reform impulse that a lot of Americans had during this time. The question starts out trying to kick us off with why is this the case? Why in 19th century America are there so many organizations dedicated to improving society? Why are there so many people, so many civic organizations and groups that want to change the world around them? Because this is the case. There are a lot of private organizations and groups that want to bring about change. And the reason, quite plain and simple, is because during this time, people saw a lot of problems that they felt needed to be solved. One of the big ones was, of course, slavery. People witnessing human bondage, particularly in the American South. The continuation of a presence of enslavement in a country founded on freedom was simply unacceptable to many people, and they wanted to see it eradicated. There was also a lot of other problems that people witnessed during this time. They saw rampant alcoholism throughout society. There was inequality for women. There was poverty, starvation, hunger, a lot of problems, and people felt that it was up to them to solve it. It's not just because they see a lot of problems, it's also because there's no one else that they feel is going to solve it except the private citizen, the private individual. There are no government organizations dedicated to helping out the impoverished. That falls on churches and private groups and philanthropists to do. So people see problems and they see themselves as charitable good folks as the only ones to bring about the solutions and to end the issues that they witness all around them. There's also this sense during this time that people are still feeling the swell of all of those awakenings, all of those religious pushes, all of those religious upswells, those awakenings that talked about personal empowerment and how people could have control over their destiny and that they could enact change. So they are, people at this time, Americans are still definitely full of this sense that the individual does have a lot of power. People can change the course of history. They can change people daily life. They can have an impact. So all of these things coalesce, and there is a big impulse to change the world that people see around them during this time. And that is indeed the first quiz question. Why did 19th century America see the growth of so many organizations dedicated to improving society? And talking a little bit about improving society, there was also a upswell of effort by certain groups, particularly religious sects, to form utopian communities. And utopian communities were indeed efforts to model perfect societies, to create a utopia. And there were plenty of people because they saw all these problems around them. Some of them had an impulse to change it, but others had an impulse to be an example of how to be better or how society should be structured. This should strike you as very much like the Puritans with their city on a hill, where they wanted to be an example that other people could copy about how society should run and how things could be perfect. You know, we'll show them that our ideas, our methods are superior to bringing about peace and equality. We'll live these ideals, and other people will be able to emulate them. So, a lot of utopian communities or efforts to create perfect societies did emerge during this time as well because of all of those problems. People see an opportunity to show the world a better way. Some examples here, specific, some that are specific to the United States. One of it is the Shakers. The Shakers were a religious group that emerged, they actually first began in the late 1700s, but they had a presence in the New England area and they preached things like equality of the sexes and separation of the sexes as well. So they were equal, but kind of kept separate. So they valued chastity and virginity, and also preached the sins of private accumulation of wealth. So the Shakers did not want to accumulate wealth. They felt that that caused a lot of social problems. To fund just being alive and having food and fund their communities, they sold things like vegetables and herbs, but they also made really nice furniture. If you ever heard of Shaker style furniture, that's what people are talking about. Furniture made by the Shakers. It's still pretty heavily prized. It's still very high quality. I think it's still being made, but the Shakers were going to show people how to have a perfect community. There were other attempts to create utopian communities and try to show that there were ways to have a perfect society or there were ways to create a utopia here on Earth. There was an attempt in New York in 1848 by a group that called themselves Oneida. They were trying to create a utopian community where they were going to solve the world's problems by forsaking private property and traditional marriage. That was how they were going to solve all problems. But it turned out that there were a lot of issues when people started having what the Oneida community called complex marriages, which is when you could have multiple spouses that just ended up kind of devolving into utter chaos. But that was their attempt to see if that was the way to solve the ills of society. A lot of them end up being arrested for adultery, so it didn't work. But there were other attempts too. Brook Farm was a secular, so non-religious attempt to create a utopian community during the 19th century. It was a community outside of Boston where a group of intellectuals were attempting to try to see if they could create this utopia where it was intellectuals working in harmony with the manual laborers and they would all just sort of have this communal living and it would be great. But it turns out that the Brook Farm experiment only attracted intellectuals and nobody really wanted to work. So nobody was doing the agriculture and growing food. It was just a bunch of intellectuals getting together and talking about how great communal living was, but nobody was actually working, so it kind of falls apart. But there are attempts. There are plenty of attempts to try to create these model societies and experiment with how we could potentially have a perfect society. Because again, people see a lot wrong with life in the 19th century, a lot of social issues going on. All right, question two. What was the goal of utopian communities? Another issue, I said people see a lot of stuff wrong. Another issue that Americans witnessed in the 19th century was the issue of temperance. So there's an issue with rampant alcohol consumption. It was pretty heavy in this during this century. There was a lot of alcohol consumed. I think it was like the most ever in American history was during the early 19th century. And there was a push to do something about alcohol consumption, the overconsumption of alcohol. And the temperance movements emerged to attempt to curtail drinking and discourage people from drinking too much and kind of ruining their own lives and the lives of their family. In 1826, temperance advocates, people who advocated for temperance or putting an end to drinking, founded the American Temperance Society with the goal of encouraging abstinence from alcohol, so no drinking. The goal of the American Temperance Society was to end drinking because they saw drinking and alcohol as the root of all social problems. They saw it as something that caused men to, as this little cartoon depicts, as men to become drunk and not be able to support their families. You can see in the middle here is the woman crying with her child because the husband was gone from just having being a social drinker to being an absolute drunkard and falling out of society here. They want to solve the world's issues by taking away alcohol. They're thinking this is hurting women, it's hurting families. Men go out and get drunk. They are causing all sorts of problems because of this, and this is something that will, this is the secret root of all of the problems. And they are moral failing as well, that it causes sort of moral failing and moral decay. And even that starting to drink in the first place was a sign of moral decay or moral weakness. So the goal was to just abstain fully, not even to drink a little bit, is that you had to just swear off alcohol. And they try very hard to encourage this by portraying alcohol as a bitter evil, something that hurts yourself when you drink it, and it destroys your family. It leaves women widows because their husbands end up going off and dying of alcoholism, or it makes men violent and they hurt their families. They spend all their money on drink and their families fall apart. So they were trying very hard to show alcohol as a moral sin, something that could cause a lot of issues and something that needed to be abstained from. All right, next question. What was the goal of the American Temperance Society? But we're going to now kind of switch to the meat of this lecture, which is going to talk about abolition, the bringing about an end to slavery or abolishing slavery, because this was seen as the most prominent social issue of the time, especially for reformers. They felt that slavery was the biggest blight on the United States and really had to go. And there were different paths that Americans took to bring about an end to slavery. The Americans who wanted to see it ended, made illegal, and have the enslaved labor force freed in some capacity. So, one of the reform efforts at the time that wanted to end slavery had to also deal with the question of what do you then do with the now free population, because that was a thorny question for a lot of people. Is some of them wanted to see slavery come to an end, but they just could not envision a biracial society, a society in which black and white Americans lived in any sort of harmony. So one abolitionist group advocated for something known as colonization. And in 1816, the American Colonization Society was formed by abolitionists who wanted to free slaves in America and bring them back to Africa. They wanted to colonize part of Africa and create a haven for freed slaves to basically free them and then remove them. The whole goal of the Colonization Society was abolition of slavery in the United States, but then sending all of that freed population back to Africa where they could live in harmony and it would not involve any real social change or or racial integration in the United States. So the American Colonization Society really wanted to send everybody away. They felt for their own good that this a freed population would face endless racism, and there was also racism motivating the colonization as well because there was an idea that a freed black population would depress wages, that you'd have all these unskilled workers that would destroy the economy of the South. Plenty of colonizationists, these abolitionists who wanted colonization, they wanted to see an end to slavery, but they just did not want to deal with a free black population either. And the American Colonization Society facilitates in 1822 the founding of Liberia, which was designed as a colony off the coast of Africa as a haven to send freed slaves. So you would free them, and this is where they were going to go. And there was a push to send free blacks and to free slaves and send them there and encourage this as the best option to solve the issue of slavery and solve the issue of what to do with a free population post eradication of slavery. Liberia ended up not being an incredibly popular option. A lot of enslaved Americans wanted their freedom, but they also wanted to remain in America and enjoy the rights of free American citizens. Africa was totally foreign to them. Themselves, sometimes even their parents and grandparents, had been born in the United States. That was their home, their culture. They wanted to stay there and they wanted to be free. They didn't want to be freed and sent to a foreign land that they had no connection to anymore. Plenty of people do go to Liberia and create a culture and a society there, but this was seen as a solution that didn't really appeal to a wide array of the enslaved population for those reasons. All right, next question. What was the goal of the American Colonization Society? Much more popular, especially amongst enslaved Americans, was just straight out abolition, getting rid of slavery and restoring the rights of American citizens, granting the rights of American citizens to a freed black population. Abolitionists had the goal of abolishing slavery. And there were different like sects, different tenets of abolition, different methods that abolitionists followed in an attempt to bring about their goal. You had different characteristics of it, sort of different tones that they would take, different paths. And one path was known as militant abolition, and militant abolitionists were those who demanded an immediate end to slavery, no questions asked. It had to go. You couldn't do it gradual. Don't bother with sending people away. You just end slavery now. It has to go. That's it. And you should do whatever it takes to end slavery, even if you have to become militant and violent. That's where it gets its name as militant abolition. One proponent of militant abolition was a free black man named David Walker, who lived in Boston. And in 1829, he published this treatise. This is a copy of it pictured here, called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. You can see the original title there. And it was published in 1829. So this is a nice little, I think this comes from one of the archives of Boston. And in this appeal, that's what it's known as. It's known as Walker's Appeal. In Walker's Appeal, he argues some of the basic tenets of militant abolition. He argues first and foremost that slavery is morally wrong, and because it's so morally wrong, it has to be ended immediately. He also tries to encourage an immediate end to slavery by arguing that its continuation is bringing about damnation for whites, that if they continue to allow slavery to exist, they are dooming themselves to hell. So that's very much encouraged by and influenced by sort of the Great Awakening ideas about controlling your destiny and needing to be a good person in order to get into heaven. Walker also argues in his appeal that the Declaration of Independence is the law of the land. All men being created equal has to be followed. He argues really even further in this that Black Americans should not fall for the promises of colonization, that that's a cheap, easy solution people thought of to get rid of them, that they should fight for their freedom and also fight for their rights as Americans by staying in America. They should not just leave and take that and let everyone just take that easy solution by simply removing them from the picture. But he's not totally against African ideas. He wants Black Americans to take pride in African heritage and not see it as something shameful or lesser than European ancestry. So there is a positive message in there about taking pride in one's past and also fighting for one's rights as an American citizen. David Walker dies under very mysterious circumstances in 1830, and one can only assume that it's probably this very fiery rhetoric that he published that might have led to something that caused his death, whether it was murder, assassination, no one's quite sure. But there are going to be others that will pick up the torch of militant abolition and carry it on in the wake of David Walker's untimely death. Next question, what did David Walker argue in his text, The Appeal? One of the individuals that would carry on the torch of very fiery rhetoric about immediate abolition was William Lloyd Garrison. He was a Northern abolitionist who definitely wanted slavery to end immediately. And to meet that end in 1831, not long after the death of David Walker, Garrison began publishing a newspaper called The Liberator, which was a mouthpiece for militant abolition. It was extremely fiery, it was extremely arousing, very inflammatory, and it had lines like this in it about abolition, that I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. So he didn't hold back anything at all. He went after slave owners ruthlessly in The Liberator, talked about them being perverse and a brood of disgusting vipers. He ended up being published quite heavily in the South because people in the South were like, "Oh, look at this guy. He's so fiery and so evil and terrible." But it ends up just getting him an even wider audience to spread his message about the evils of slavery. People are even people who condemned Garrison were giving him airspace. They were giving him more attention, which is what he wanted. He wanted his message to go out there about needing to bring about an immediate end to slavery. So he's a very important figure because he does bring a lot of attention to the abolitionist cause, injects a lot of energy into it. All right, next question. Who was William Lloyd Garrison? Tell me a little bit about him. And even people who don't necessarily feel that slavery has anything to do with them or they don't really have much sympathy for the enslaved population can recognize that slavery and slave owners do pose a threat to civil liberties or the freedoms of all Americans. And what I mean by this is that let's say there's someone in the North who just isn't really very concerned with the plight of enslaved Americans, but they're going to start witnessing things that are going to happen to abolitionists that make them question the morality of slave owners and by extension the morality of slavery. So Northerners in particular, and just people all over the United States, start to see actions taken by pro-slavery advocates that make them question slavery as a system, as a process. Some of the actions taken by people who support slavery will make other people not support it. They're going to do some pretty dastardly things that make a lot of people wonder, wow, slave owners are doing all of these horrible things. Slave owners don't sound like very good people now. Maybe slavery is also bad too. Like if people hadn't made that connection before, they're going to make it after some of these events. It's very easy during this time for some people in the North to kind of write off slavery because they're not really witnessing it. They don't see it, they don't might not be hearing about it. But when they hear about these events, it starts to bring it more to their attention. They think of slavery and slave owners as a threat to their civil liberties, as people who don't respect things like freedom of speech. They might not agree with abolition, but they don't like how evil people are being to abolitionists and crushing their messages. One instance that really brings about a lot of sentiment, a lot of negative sentiment towards slave owners is something that happens in 1835. William Lloyd Garrison is uh, speaking, he's always giving these loud, fiery speeches. He's speaking in Boston, and as this cartoon depicts, Garrison is attacked by a mob who try to hang him. They put a noose around his neck and they chase him all around the town because they're heckling him about his message and his support for abolition. And it's so violent and it's so it's seen as so against the First Amendment, against free speech and assembly, that the vicious attack against Garrison gets him a lot more sympathy, and it starts to make people question the morality of slave owners. They're thinking, wow, these people won't even listen to him. He's not even allowed to speak without getting ripped through town with a noose around his neck. So Garrison's attack shows that this is a group of people, pro-slavery advocates, is a group of people that are totally unwilling to even listen to opposition. So it garners more sympathy for abolitionists like Garrison, and it grows ire for the slave owners and supporters of slavery. Another incident that really stokes the fire and makes people start to question the morality of pro-slavery advocates is in 1837, a abolitionist printer in Illinois named Elijah Lovejoy is killed trying to defend his printing press from a pro-slavery mob. Elijah Lovejoy, much like William Lloyd Garrison, had a newspaper he printed that had abolitionist messages and that slavery needed to end. Pro-slavery supporters did not want Lovejoy to publish his paper. They attack his printing press. He tries to defend it. He's killed doing so. Another incident where people start to see that, wow, the pro-slavery force is really violent and very easily inflamed and kind of murderous too, and really just not willing to allow others to enjoy civil liberties. It should have been Elijah Lovejoy's constitutional right to publish, have freedom of press. And he was not able to exercise that right because of the opinions of people supporting slavery. Another incident that really gets attention too, 1838. There is a hall in Pennsylvania known as Pennsylvania Hall, and it's a hall where abolitionists hold a lot of their meetings. They talk about ways to end slavery. Pro-slavery forces burn it down so that the abolitionists can't hold their meetings anymore. It's just seen as another in a long line of incidents of pro-slavery people being unreasonable and very, very violent. All right, next question. Why were people who supported slavery viewed as threats to civil liberties and rights? Now, I want to talk now and kind of connect these two because we have this discussion. We've got abolition sentiment going on, abolitionists being attacked, this ongoing debate about abolition. But abolition as a social movement is going to attract people for various reasons because they think slavery is morally wrong, maybe because they think slave owners are violent and they don't want to see them get too much attention. They think that they need to be curtailed after all of those violent events that they do, like killing Elijah Lovejoy and burning down a meeting hall. But abolition is also going to gain the support of a lot of women because women are going to see some parallels between their own situation and that of enslaved Americans. There was a reformer, Abby Kelly. She was a white Northern woman. She joined the abolitionist cause because she sympathized a lot with enslaved women. She felt that they had a double burden of being enslaved, but also because they were women, and women were subservient to men. And Abby Kelly and many others like her hoped that all this talk of freedom and equality would also engender the same for women, that if you work towards ending slavery, that would also bring about change for women. You keep talking about equality for all in an effort to end slavery, you will also help bring it about for women who are in their own position of subservience. They can't vote. Some of them can't own property. They're bound to their husbands or a male family member. They don't have the same rights as men, a big one being the right to vote. And a lot of women hoped that by really rallying people behind abolition and keeping that rhetoric of equality in the public mind, they would, as Abby Kelly's quote illustrates here, women would be able to sort of strike off their own manacles, that they would bring about their own freedom. They needed to sort of lead the charge and start out with helping and to end slavery. All right, next question. Why did many women join the abolitionist movements? And to that end, there was an upswell of desire amongst women to bring about more rights for themselves, particularly the right to vote, because women were not allowed to vote at this time. In 1848, New York anti-slavery activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention, which was an attempt to get women politically active to get the right to vote. And part of the reason why Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott did this is because they had attempted to they were politically active. They were abolitionists. And they had attempted to join an anti-slavery meeting in London, but they were refused entry to this abolitionist meeting because they were women. And for them, they thought, okay, we need to do something about this and focus on women's rights as well, because we were here trying to advocate for the end of slavery, and we see ourselves treated as second-class citizens. So they organized this meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the issue of women's rights and bring it to the forefront of the minds of Americans. And one of the effects of this, one of the outcomes of the Seneca Falls Convention is a lot of the people who met there, women and men, publish and publicize something known as the Declaration of Sentiments. This is a declaration based on the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Sentiments is indeed a declaration that argues that the biggest thing that women need to fight for is the right to vote. They need enfranchisement. That will be the first thing to solve all the rest of their problems because all of the problems that women face, people like Cady Stanton and Mott see that voting is the way to solve it because if women are enfranchised, they will be able to cast ballots and enact change that will solve the rest of their problems. So the root of their problem is lack of enfranchisement. And the Declaration of Sentiments argues this and argues that by enfranchising women, you will help them and others solve all of the rest of the social problems that they are all facing. So this would had to be the first step. All right, next question. What was the argument of the Declaration of Sentiments? So this the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention is viewed by most historians as the official kickoff of the women's rights movement, and it is kind of concurrent along with abolition. You've got abolition politicizing a lot of women and getting them into the political sphere, and then making them realize that, okay, we need to fight for our own rights as well. However, there was a lot of opposition to women's suffrage. There was not widespread support for women getting the right to vote. One of the reasons was that plenty of people felt it was too radical, even abolitionists. I mean, remember that what I just said about Stanton and Mott getting kicked out of an abolitionist meeting because they're women? A lot of abolitionists were like, no, we're not fighting for women's rights. We're fighting to end slavery. And part of the reason why that was the case was that a lot of people felt that women's suffrage was secondary to the plight of enslaved Americans, that that needed to come first. You have to deal with the issue of slavery before you could start talking about women's rights. Part of the reason why this was the case is that people saw slavery as a much bigger issue. Slavery meant violence, beating, whipping, selling families apart, horrible treatment, cruelty, that needed to go first and foremost. You can't talk about women voting when you have people being beaten and sold away from one another. So a lot of activists feared that by expanding their platform to include women's rights, you were going to lose support for abolition as well. I hope this kind of reminds you a little bit of those discussions we had about ratifying the Constitution and enfranchising all. You want to have a really tight, narrow platform when you're advocating for something radical because you want as much support as possible. Abolitionists did not want to lose potential support for their cause by broadening their platform to include votes for women. And a lot of people felt that that would just simply alienate supporters for ending slavery. People could support an end to that system, but not a lot of them wanted to also include women's suffrage or women getting the right to vote as well. There were also other reasons for the opposition, as opposition to votes for women. Plenty of people still felt that women simply were not political beings. They had no business in politics or voting. It was going to really complicate things, and it would sort of destroy the family structure of America, that it would take women away from their household duties. Like pictured here, this poor miserable family, the man, he looks absolutely traumatized. The wife is clearly not home to make dinner for him and this sad child because she's out at a women's suffrage meeting. You see, she's got a Votes for Women poster up, and that little note says back sometime this evening. So she's gone, and he comes home, and there's no woman there to care for the family because she's too busy being politically active. There was a genuine fear that this would just destroy society by making women political figures who would go off and be so concerned with politics and voting that children and families would suffer and fall apart. So, final quiz question, why was there opposition to women's suffrage? And this sort of just gives you a basis for a lot of the reform movements of the time, a big one being slavery. The abolitionist movement does spark the women's rights movement. This is going to indeed take a back row seat to to abolition because a lot of people do indeed agree that this needs to take priority, that abolition needs to take priority. And for the rest of this course, we are going to be focusing more on issues with slavery and how this does indeed lead to the American Civil War.